Thank you all for coming for yet another shiur, lecture, whatever we're going to call it, on the Akedah through the ages. We know, I think from our time together, that as it says in Parshat Vayera, some time ago at the beginning of Jewish history, an inscrutable God without explanation asked a pious man, Abraham, to sacrifice his beloved son, and without questioning, he did it, or he was willing to do it without reservation. But in the end, God changed his mind, and the father and son are, the familial unit is intact to some extent, although we read last time in Elie Wiesel's writings especially that there was still damage that was done. They left separately and they remained separate for the most part for the rest of their lives. So it was, not all was well in the end. I know that was a little heavy. But we've seen two things over our time together. We've seen, one, that this dramatic event of the Akedah is one of the most important parts of Jewish history and Jewish tradition and narrative, and it becomes a touchstone throughout the ages, from a medieval German pietist who sees in Abraham a person to emulate, a model for behavior, to the Jews during the Crusades who see their own suffering through the lens of the Akedah, or they see the Akedah through the lens of their suffering, depending upon how you want to view it, to Israeli poets who we'll look at next time. Also, their own experiences are refracted through the Akedah. They see themselves in the Akedah to the extent that some Jewish writers see the Akedah and recast it as a story of actualized death, where some kind of sacrifice, meaningful sacrifice, takes place. So that's definitely one thing that we've seen, one of the themes of this series that we've noticed together is that Jews see the Akedah through the lens of their own experiences. Another thing that we've seen is that you can't be neutral when it comes to the Akedah. You either love it or hate it. Abraham is either the knight of faith, Kierkegaard's knight of faith, or he's a noble rationalist, a la Rav Kook, right? He was disciplined and reasonable, and of course listened to the great test of stay your hand, right? That's the test for Rav Kook. Or he was a wackadoo, according to Kant, who was hearing voices telling him to murder people, and he should not have listened to those voices, right? So people either hold him up, marvel at his wonders, or they are upset with him and think he was an evil madman. Here you go. If we need any more, we'll pass those down. Thank you. So today what I'd like to do is, our discussion is going to revolve around those axes as well. Okay? Today the discussion is also going to be about seeing the Akedah through our own experiences, as Jews have done throughout history, and also this controversial Akedah, the Akedah that's one of piety on the one hand and one of protest on the other. Some people see it as a pious act, some people see it as a story of piety, and some people see it as a story of non-piety, right? So we'll see that as we look at the Akedah in art of Jews, Christians, and Muslims, mostly Jews, but we'll also look at it through the lens of other religions as well. And hopefully that'll lead seamlessly into our next and final session, the grand finale of the Akedah in Zionist literature, which I've been trying to get in there, and is just not working. But this is the day that I was given this and this room, so I said, let's do art this time, okay? So we'll plunge right in. I know I run the risk of going over time, but I was told I'm not allowed today. So we're going to try to do as much as we can in the time allotted, okay? So we're going to start with the images, and you have the images there, and then after the images you have the sources that we'll be looking at together. And for the most part, the sources today will be illustrative. We're not going to delve into the sources. They're just going to kind of help us understand where the paintings and the images are coming from, and what kind of midrashim they're using. Prior to the 1930s, most scholars were convinced that ancient Jewry produced no art. Okay? They didn't have any Jewish art, they didn't find any Jewish art from the ancient time period, and they assumed that Jews didn't produce any. And as a result, the discovery in 1932 of the Dura Europa synagogue in Syria was mind-blowing. It really shocked the academic world. And these are basically the earliest extant Jewish examples of Jewish art, which are probably antedate. They probably come before the real emergence of Christianity. And here in Dura Europos, and I'm going to shut the light for a second, just so you see the grandeur. I mean, this is a beautiful synagogue. Can you imagine if our synagogues had this kind of art on all the walls all over the place? It's a really beautiful thing to have discovered and to see. What's painted here in the Dura Europa synagogue are all different biblical scenes. So of course one of the major biblical scenes that are on here is the story of the Akedah. And in this representation of the Akedah, we see a real acceptance of the rabbinic tradition of Midrashim. Oh, that's not good. Sorry about that. Okay, so here is the representation of the Akedah at Juri Europus. And we see here that a few things. We see Abraham over here, right? His back is to the viewer. Here's little Yitzchak over here, swaddled really tightly. His back is also toward us. I mean, it's a little hard to see because it's an ancient image, and also it's, copies and copies and copies, over and over again. Although it's from the internet, whatever. Anyway, this is Sarah over there. Her back is toward us as well, if you could see that. And so they're all looking away from us, right? The ram is tethered to a tree, not tethered to the bush in this kind of messy way. Remember we were talking about the ram being, according to the Midrash, being entangled, just like we're kind of like entangled in our own suffering, whatever. So it's not caught messily, it's not put there by chance, it's tethered. Somebody tied it, right? It's kind of like it's been prepared, right? Some entity has placed it there very conscientiously, purposefully. And this really reminds us of the notion that the ram, and we see it in the Midrash, and it's the first source that you have on the sheet, the notion in the Midrash that the ram was created during the first days of creation, at twilight on the eve, Friday night, right before the Shabbat, and it was put in place because it was going to appear. It's kind of like part of the template of the destiny of the Jewish people. It's going to reappear throughout the history of the Jewish people. So here we get the sense that this ram is placed here either, by God, basically, if it's based on that midrash, that it's there awaiting its destiny. It's awaiting its job. It has some kind of task. Somebody put it there so that it could fulfill its task. And we also have here, in that same vein, are the hands of God up there. We have the hands of God coming from Shamayim, and this is very interesting in terms of and all of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac, all the figures here are facing the hand of God. They're looking toward the hand of God, right? On the one hand, we have this notion that they're looking off into the distance, like in the Psukim that it says Hamakom Asher Amar Lo Elokim, the place, this mysterious place, right? That he wasn't really sure where he's, the place where God is going to show him, right? And he's looking off. God is showing him here. This is the place, with his hands. Here's the place where I want you to be. They're not looking at us. They're focused on kind of like the hands of God and the direction that the hands of God are giving. But it's also interesting that there's God there and not an angel, because according to the text, it was really the angel was really present at the Akedah. And so this is something that scholars see as based on. Sorry, I don't want to do it over and over and over again. I'll just do it a few times. This is what scholars really see as based on rabbinic midrashim, on midrashim that kind of reinsert God into the text, kind of replacing the angel, so to speak. So if you look in Breshit Rabbah, the second source on the sheet, we have Amar Rav Acha, Etmol amarti li ki b'Yitzchak yikrei lechazera. We've seen this before. So Avram's all confused. First, you tell me he's gonna make Isaac into a great nation. Then you tell me to slaughter him. Then you tell me not to slaughter him. Hashem says, don't worry, don't worry, Abraham, I'm gonna fulfill all of my promises to you. From the time I said that to you, I wasn't really switching my words or anything. There I told you shachtehu, lo ha'alehu, and this is what we saw, I think, maybe even in the first session together. I never told you to offer him. I only said, bring him up. Asiktnei achte, bring him up. Now bring him down. Right. So this midrash comes under the heading, comes under the pasuk, comes to explain the pasuk. Al tishlach yadcha el hanar. Who says Al Tishlach Yadcha El Hanar? The angel. So what this midrash does is turns it over. It says precisely on that pasuk where the angel is speaking to Abraham, it gives this whole dialogue between Abraham and God, right? So it's no longer really an angel being involved in this whole thing. It's God and Abraham speaking directly, right? So there's this kind of tradition, there's this stream of thought within the Midrash that God was really the one who was, orchestrating everything on a very detailed level, even when the Malach was there. So when we see images like this, where it's really God's presence, and we see it a lot in the ancient pictures, and I'll show you another one in a second. We see it also at Beit Alpha. It might be based on these kind of midrashim that put God, really emphasize that God was there. Just another midrash. This is from the Buber. This is the Tanhuma, the end of the Tanhuma in Vayera. It's the Buber edition. It's the one that I guess academics use. It's based on manuscripts, and so we have this interesting thing that we find in a manuscript of the Tanhuma. It says, when the angel came, right? The angel comes, right? So there's the angel. That's the text that it's expounding upon. Amar lo Abraham miata. God, Abraham doesn't recognize. Who are you? Amar lo malachani. It's very complex dialogue. The malach says, malach, right? Amar lo Abraham amar li hakadosh baruch hu lahakrivo hu ba'atzmo amar li. Right? It was really when the entity who told me to sacrifice was God himself. V'achshav ani mevakesh amar li hu ba'atzmo. And I want God here now. I don't want you, angel, right? Miyad patach hakadosh baruch hu et harakia v'et harafel. Marlo bi nishpati, and so God opens the heavens, and God Himself in all His glory comes and gives the message, right? So there's this idea, this again notion in the midrash that the malach is not really there so much. The midrash tries to reinsert God, and so we see that in the. Let's try it again. Yes, in the ancient. Pictures as well. Here we have Beit Alpha. We have an image of Beit Alpha. This is the entire floor of the Beit Alpha synagogue. Just 3 years prior to discovering Dura Europos, this was found at Kibbutz Beit Alpha. This is the earliest Akedah to be found in Israel. And the zodiac is, the floor is very well known because it has Jewish and Christian and pagan elements, which just kind of like speaks to the cultural context in which the Jews were worshiping at this time.
Did you say it was pre-Christianity though?
So this is later. This is found. The other one, this is a different one. The pre-Christianity one is Dura Europos.
So this one is what year? Do you have any?
This is 6th century.
Okay.
Okay. So this is 6th century. So here's the Beit Alpha synagogue, and here we have when you first walk in, the first thing that you see is this Akedah scene, right? So it's very Jewish. Then you see this zodiac, which is very pagan, especially since it has Helios, the sun god, in the middle. I don't know if you can see with the lights off, lights on, whatever. There's this image with this kind of like rays of light coming off of it. That's Helios. Not to say that the Jews were worshiping paganism. It was just like, I don't know, Thanksgiving. It was like, the culture at the time. We also, as people see Christian iconography, kind of, sort of, and this is debatable, in the fact that the ram over here, up here, by the way, is the temple, okay, the Beit HaMikdash. And over here, in the figure of Abraham and Isaac and the Akedah and the ram is hanging. So people see that this is, a touch of Christianity kind of making it in there, some kind of parallelism between, Yitzchak, the ram, and Jesus, And again, that's debatable, but you see some taste of Christianity.
You mean hanging like on a cross?
No, just hanging. Yeah, I'll show it to you.
Oh, that one?
Bigger. Just hanging.
So
Like
what does that have to
it
do
could
with
be tethering. It could be. Well, it is. He is hanging from a tree, right? The cross is always, the cross is wooden. The cross is wood is always associated with the cross. Whatever. It could just be that he's tethered. It is a kind of weird configuration. It's not. The tree is kind of up here and he's down there. But I don't know if you're reading too much into it. Take it as you want to take it. I'm not really sure. Nobody's really sure, but so that's been put forth.
And it really has the Hebrew words.
Yeah, yeah. So this is the scene
That's amazing.
at Beit Alpha also. Here's the hand of God as well, right? So the hand of God coming out. The rakia has opened up, right? Abraham says, "No, I want God here. I want and no angels," right? So we have a kind of similar thing happening here also. The truth is, like, he's also in midair, like. Yitzchak's also in midair. I don't know. I don't know exactly what it means. But it's interesting also here that the ram kind of takes center stage, right? Mm-hmm. The ram is right in the center. I don't know, you'd think maybe Avraham Yitzchak would be at the center. And the fact that this has the ram at the center, and at the top has the Beit HaMikdash, and also, has the temple, and also in our other one, right, in Dura Europus, this is Dura Europus in general, right? Here we have the Akedah, and right next to the Akedah, here's the Akedah, right? Right next to it is an image of the temple, right? So they're kind of looking off into the distance. God's hands are going like this, like that, pointing this way, pointing that way, and they're looking off. Abraham's looking off to, where should I go? And God is pointing, go here, right? So this kind of association between the Akedah and the temple, and these midrashic, interpolations using the midrash to create these images, seem to point to the fact that these are hopeful, like traditional rabbinic images that are hopeful that the Akedah and the temple are kind of on the same continuum. They're kind of part of the same kind of destiny of the Jewish people. And we've spoken about redemption, right? The Akedah as being the beginning, as being the origin for redemption. God should remember it when the Jews are praying for redemption. God should remember it at the time of redemption. So they're all kind of like, they're part of the same saga. When they're making a picture of the Beit HaMikdash, they're also making a picture of like the beginnings of this relationship that's going to lead to the Beit HaMikdash. So it's a kind of redemptive look at what the Akedah is all about.
It was the same place too, physically.
Yeah, but right, the same place physically, right. So it's all part of the same thing, right. When God said, this is the place, he was also thinking that this is going to be the place of the Beit HaMikdash, of, Mount Moriah. So that's what we see in the ancient images. And just
Can I just ask, there were 2 women and a donkey?
yes. Well, I don't know if they're women, those are probably servants.
Oh.
Yes.
Point of clarification, did you just say the Akedah is believed to have taken place where the temple was built? Physically? Is that what you just said?
Yeah, the same way.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing is, after we have these ancient images, right, we don't see Jews making pictures of the Akedah for a long time. So we're gonna have to jump now from the ancient period to the medieval period. We're gonna start with looking at one Christian one, and then I'm gonna show you an interesting thing that happens when Jews start to represent the Akedah in the medieval period, okay? So first, we'll go to this one. This is the Chartres Cathedral, okay? Cathedral in France. And here we have this kind of linear image of Abraham and Isaac and the ram, right? And they look what? How do they look? Does this look
Christian, very Christian.
okay? Why do you say that?
They have that chiseled white marble look of.
Oh yes, there's just some kind of radiance about it. They're looking upward. I think it looks peaceful.
Right, too
They're basking in the grace of God, right? Or maybe that's what you're feeling. You're feeling that Christian sensibility, right? He's tenderly holding his child's head, right? This is not. There's no scary knife. There's no blood. There's no pain. This is a father and son walking harmoniously together, enjoying each other. There's a sense actually of safety. If you had to put a caption to this from the psukim, you might do, v'leichu shnehem yachdav. There's real togetherness. There's real, harmony. This is the pious Abraham who did nothing wrong, nothing controversial, nothing too scary, right? So that's.
Yitzchak's feet are not bound together?
They are bound together. They are bound
Not so
together.
good for taking a
Not
walk.
so good for taking a walk. That's true. It's definitely the Akedah. It is the Akedah, and that's the sign of the Akedah, and the ram is the sign of the Akedah. But in general, you don't. That's a relatively minor part of the piece, although it's definitely noticeable. That's what identifies it as the Akedah. But you look at it and you don't see like trauma, right? And so that's definitely what we see in the beginning of the Middle Ages in terms of Christians and the Akedah. And the Akedah is a beautiful thing. It prefigures Christ. You know, he is a knight of faith. Abraham and Isaac are pious, and everything is great. You know, just keep this in mind. We'll revisit it next time. Yes.
And alongside Abraham.
These are other
Are the angels
biblical
with
figures.
have the halos?
So if they have halos, it doesn't necessarily mean they're angels. This is big. This is the Akedah. There's no more to that story. These are other figures, other biblical figures. Yeah. Okay. And then talking about the Middle Ages, we get to the Jewish imagery. Okay. So at the same time that the Chartres Cathedral has this kind of image, Jews are making the image of the Akedah resurfaces. We haven't seen it for a long time. We haven't seen it since the 6th century, and now we're talking about the 13th century. This is we see it again in the 13th century, so many hundreds of years later. And when it resurfaces in Jewish arts, it resurfaces in a very interesting way. Okay, as we mentioned earlier in other talks, you know, some of these things are going to be familiar to you. By the 13th century, the Jews had developed the Ashkenazi Jews had developed a kind of worldview that linked children with sacrifice. Okay, this is something that could make us uncomfortable. It was an anomalous kind of thing that happened in the history of the Jewish people, where children were seen almost a priori as being, you know, as pure sacrificial entities. I don't know how else to say it. And at the same time that Christians were envisioning Jesus as a child, newly in the 12th, 13th century, instead of as the 37-year-old on the cross, right? And at the same time that Christians were talking about Jesus as superior because he was an actualized sacrifice, rather than Yitzchak, who was a little bit inferior because he didn't actually have to go through with the sacrifice, Jews start to, we know from the Midrashim of the Middle Ages, Jews start to talk about Isaac also as having been an actualized sacrifice. They want to reclaim that, you know, that image and that tradition, right, for themselves. So we see these kind of things reflected in how they visually portray the Akedah. Just in order, before I get to this, the art, I want to just introduce you to a few things in terms of just reminding you and maybe introducing from the beginning. This notion in the 12th and 13th century, Jews are associating children with sacrifice. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but there was a special initiation ceremony, a ceremony in the Middle Ages that Jews did that was the precursor to the Upsharon. I don't know if I ever mentioned this. I didn't? Okay. So this is very interesting. And you know, at some point it might be nice to talk about it in depth. But in the 12th, 13th century, Ashkenazi Jews had an interesting ceremony. They would bring all the 5-year-olds on Shavuos time, the time of Matan Torah, to the synagogue. They would be wrapped as little Torahs. They would be wrapped like in talesim, right, and brought to the synagogue. And when they would come to the synagogue, everybody would stand up as if the Torah is coming in. And the children would be put down, and they would almost recreate Har Sinai, right? So they would accept the Torah. Their teacher would come down with the Torah, and they would accept the Torah, and they would literally ingest the words of Torah, take the Torah into their bodies, because the Torah was written, Pesukim of the Torah were written on small cakes and on eggs, so they literally became one with the Torah, right? And in that sense, like Shavuos was a child-oriented holiday. It's not that the adults were receiving the Torah on Shavuos, the children were receiving the Torah on Shavuot. And an interesting thing that we see in the descriptions of that ceremony is that children were asked to start their studies of Torah, their acceptance of Torah, with learning what book? What would you think? Vayikra. Right, okay, good. So the sources actually say that maybe it should have been Bereshit, right? Bereshit, let's start from the beginning of the creation of the world. But in fact, they start with Vayikra, so you're familiar with this. And Vayikra Rabbah, and it's based on the fact that Vayikra Rabbah says that children are pure like sacrifices. Pure things should occupy themselves with pure things. children should occupy themselves with sacrifice, because Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, starts with all the rules of sacrifices. So children, the first thing they learn are about sacrifices, how to do sacrifices, when to do sacrifices, because they themselves are as pure as sacrifices. They are like sacrifices. They can associate and relate to this whole sacrificial thing because they themselves are like that. We just have Vayikra Rabbah here on the sheet. Amar Rav Isi, Mipnei ma matchilin letinokot b'Torat Kohanim, yatchilu lahem miBreshit. Why are they starting with Torah Kohanim, with Vayikra? They should start from Breshit. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ho'il v'kabarnot tehorin v'hatinakot tehorin, yaviu tehorin v'yitasku b'tehorin. So children should be involved with sacrificial texts because they themselves are tahor, like sacrifices. So that's why in this ceremony they started the studies, they started children, they initiate their study, their Torah education with Vayikra, because in some sense they are like sacrifices. We also know that in descriptions of circumcision at this time, again, and for sure I mentioned him because I remember making the joke of Jack the Ripper, Jacob HaGozer, right? He was a guy, he was a rabbi who made a manual for circumcision, how to do circumcision. In the 12th, 13th century, along with his son, he wrote this manual, and throughout that is laced this kind of imagery of circumcision as a sacrificial ceremony. He says the father brings his son to circumcise as if he's bringing a sacrifice on that morning. Things like that over and over and over again. So we have this notion of like children being brought to the synagogue as kind of like sacrificial kind of things, which in my studies, my interest, because what I read and study about is child martyrdom in the 12th and 13th century in Jewish and Christian circles. We see that playing out in Chronicles as well, when Jews write about, unfortunately, the horrors of and their decision to slaughter their children in the face of the Crusades. They write about the killing of their children as if it's sacrifices, as if they're performing sacrifices. So I just gave you a small snippet. This story is completely and utterly evocative and heart-wrenching, and it's a very long story, this particular one that I gave you an excerpt about Mar Yitzchak HaTzadik. Mar Yitzchak HaTzadik apparently baptized his children to try to save them, and then he thinks that was a bad idea. He retracts from that. He says, I can't believe I just did that. And in order to atone for his sin of baptizing his children, he kills his entire family for God. His mother, who's ill and bound to a bed, says, what are you doing, as he's starting to light the house on fire, like crazy things. What?
Why don't we preserve this and teach about this?
We don't. This is something that a lot of people don't know about. It's not something, that it's, we have the Akedah and this imagery of just like the horrors of the Crusades and our children as Akedot in liturgy that we say, in the Slichot and the Piyutim, whatever that we say to this very day. But these stories of like Jews and their decision to like do these kind of things is not something that's very popular, that doesn't come up in our liturgy, for example. We don't say it over and over again on Rosh Hashanah or anything like that. Yeah.
Two questions. First of all, when they had this children's Shavuot,
Yes.
was it also girls or was it just boys?
Boys.
Boy.
Only boys when they're 5 years old. I don't cut any hair.
Okay.
That's Hasidah, that's, right,
Okay.
right.
Okay. And the other thing is, are there like shalos and shuvos at that time how were the chachamim? Did they look the other way? Did they encourage this? Did they discourage
What, the
it?
martyrdom, the sacrifice of
Yes.
children? Okay, so that's a great question and a long and complex answer. They wrestle with it a lot. When I teach the Crusades to my students, I teach them, because I can't go through everything. It's very, very complicated. It could be a class in and of itself. I teach them a Tosfot, where Rabbeinu Tam and the Rabbeinu Yitzchak, kind of hash this out, not very explicitly. They're talking about Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah. And they're trying to understand why the Gemara says what it says about Hanan, Mishael, and Azariah, and they basically, in their interpretation of the story of Hanan, Mishael, and Azariah, come to the conclusion that the reason why the Gemara is so astounded at what they did, right? In other words, the Gemara says why they do this.
What did they do?
They put themselves in the kivshan. They were willing to martyr themselves. Okay. And the Gemara says, what the heck? Why do they do that? And the Tosfot says, what do you mean? What the heck? That's a great thing to do. Why are you troubled by that? So then the Tosfot has to explain why they're troubled by that. So Rabbeinu Tam says they're troubled by that because they didn't have to martyr themselves. Because what Nebuchadnezzar was asking them to do was not avodah zarah. He was asking them to simply pay homage to his statue, not to actually bow down to it, like as if we would go to see the Lincoln Memorial and maybe just say, hi Lincoln, or whatever, or I don't know, the Queen of England, right? We're not worshiping her if we kiss her hand or whatever we have to do, I don't know.
Right.
So that's why the Gemara is so astounded they were willing to sacrifice themselves for this, because it wasn't a big deal, it wasn't about the Zara. And Rabbi Yitzchak says the reason is because they could have run away. There were opportunities for them to run away, so that's why the Gemara is so astounded that they said, we're going to martyr ourselves. They could have just said, we're just going to slip out right now, right? Like there were alternatives, right? So basically,
Will the following girls
what was so
please
great
go
about
to the
what they
nurse's office
did?
now?
What made it sound
Esther
really
Brodsky,
good,
Yael
what was so great was
Ebenhead,
that they
Raina
went beyond the
Goldman,
law.
Ariella Halstock,
That they went beyond
Sephora
the law,
Hirschman,
and that's a
Connor
noble
Colbert,
thing,
Rachel
right? To
Levine,
martyr themselves.
Rebecca Malik,
So you get the notion that the rabbis thought
Rebecca
martyrdom
Malik,
as
Rachel
a
Malik,
noble thing,
Elisheva Merwitz,
that was
Dahlia
beyond
Schwartz,
the
Robbie
law,
Schwartz,
right? So it wasn't
Leah
something that you were
Silver,
required to do, but an
Yael
absolutely
Skydel,
wonderful thing.
Leora Wasserman, and
There's
Tamara
also a
Zikin.
responsa
Please all make
that
your
was
way
given
to the nurse's office.
Maharam of Rothenburg. After the fact, a father says, I sacrificed my son. Can I kill myself? I can't live with myself.
Please
And the
note that
Maharam
any
says,
tests will be given in the
to
classrooms and
his
not in
audience,
the
not
NPR.
necessarily to that father, I'm hard pressed to find halachic justification for what you did.
All 10th graders
But I know what you
who are
did
taking an
was
exam
was
with
wonderful.
Mrs. Taltim, and we
you
are
don't have
going
to
to
do
be
a
in our
like that.
classroom.
So there's
10th
kind of like
grade
this
to take an
emotional
exam
kind
in
of,
Ivrit right now with
I don't
Mrs.
know,
Taltim.
feeling
go to the
amongst
classroom. Thank you.
amongst the rabbis that push them to legitimize it in some way and sometimes even glorify it without actually giving concrete halachic justification for it.
I guess we have to know whether did they do that to their own children. Another question.
Right, it's unclear who wrote the Chronicles and all that kind of. Anyway, so this source, basically, I'm not going to read it inside for lack of time because there's so many beautiful images I want to get to. But this source basically talks about when he brought with this Yitzchak brought his children to kill them, to slaughter them. He brings them. It's like a very clear process. He brings them to the synagogue, which is like the Mikdash Ma'at, and he puts them in front of the Aron Kodesh. Right, he puts them, like on a mizbeach. He slaughters them. He sprinkles their blood as if he's a Kohen Gadol. Like there's real imagery here, and he says this should be an atonement. Like these are sacrifices that I bring. That this should be an atonement for my sins.
Naomi Brock,
there's
Naomi Brock, if you
real,
have a minute, can I see you please? Nothing
sacrificial
bad.
imagery. So getting back to the medieval sources, we see a few things. Okay, we see in medieval 13th century Machzorim, Sidurim, whatever Bibles, we see number one Yitzchak as a child. Okay, Yitzchak as a child, not Yitzchak as an adult. And this was an interesting thing to portray.
Sarah Miriam.
Yitzchak as a child, especially in the face of the fact that the Midrashim really wrestled with how old he was, and the conclusion is mostly that he was an adult. He himself didn't like Jesus, kind of. It was in his 30s. He was potentially 37 years old. And I have, two examples on the sheet where the Midrash in Breshit Rabbah says, is it, in order to show
Yardena Stelzer, please come up to the learning center. Yardena Stelzer.
So he's an adult, and then Ibn Ezra says that's crazy. He wasn't an adult, but it also can't be that he's 5 years old because he was carrying the Psukim tells he was carrying the wood, and a 5-year-old can't carry the wood, so he comes to the conclusion that he's 13. Things like that. So the Midrashim and the expounders, the commentators, really wrestle with how old Yitzchak is. Here, he's clearly, in the Middle Ages, 13th century, he's clearly a child. There's no reservations. We don't see him as portrayed as an adult at all. Okay, so that's one thing that I think is worth noticing. Here's Yitzchak over here as a child. Here's Yitzchak over here as a child. Here's the Akedah, similar to a circumcision, right? So there's this sacrificial notion over here and a sacrificial notion over here because they thought of circumcision as a sacrifice also. And we have this notion of actual temple sacrifice in the sense that in some cases he's wearing, Abraham's wearing a talit, right? He's like a high priest, right? He's wearing, a religious garb, and the high priest didn't wear a talit per se, but that's one of the ways in which the high priesthood was conceptualized in the Middle Ages, with what they wore. So wearing a talit seems to suggest some role within the temple or synagogue service. He's in a synagogue, ready to sacrifice his child, like that Mar Yitzchak, so to speak. And in one case, the Akedah also, the Akedah appears at Vayikra, right? this Vayikra is about sacrifices, right? So, temple sacrifices. So the fact that the Akedah is the thing to illustrate the opening to Vayikra seems to associate this, this willingness to slaughter a child with sacrifices and things like that. And in one case as well, the image of the Akedah appears aside the commandment to honor thy father and mother, right? So there's this notion that's kind of like a child's duty to be willing to submit to this kind of thing. It's a sacrificial duty connected to the receipt of the Torah, because specifically this specific image, where it says it's within the context of a piyut that's recited on Shavuot. So, and it gets complicated, but it's a text that you read on Shavuot where it says and the thing to illustrate that is the Akedah, right? So you kind of get this notion that at this time period, the Akedah is a very late, Akkad is a very laden shoresh. I have to show you another one that's whack crazy. This one, okay? If in the Middle Ages they spoke about Isaac's ashes, that Isaac was actually killed, this one, it's a little hard to see, so I'm going to close the light over here. This one has it's to be read kind of read in a circle. There are very interesting things happening in this medieval one. On the bottom left over here, and it's effaced, so it's hard to see. It's not a great condition, the manuscript itself. But here we have Sarah over there, maybe saying goodbye, right? Here the servants are going, ostensibly with Yitzchak. So that's what's on the bottom over there. She's bidding her son goodbye with the 2 donkeys. In the middle we have Isaac bound on the altar with Abraham and a very large ma'achelet, a very large knife, potentially with a servant over there as well. Obviously these things are not happening exactly at the same time. This is supposed to kind of like tell us a little bit of a narrative over here. We have 3 angels, and this is what's really interesting to see. 1, 2, 3. We know they're angels because they're differentiated from the other people by their halos and they have wings. Okay, 2 of them are in the celestial sphere, are in the heavens. This one, because this appears in a part of the text that we're supposed to read on Rosh Hashanah. Okay, this is the text that we're supposed to read on Rosh Hashanah. This is Machzor, yes, I believe, yes. Here we have one of the angels holding the scales, right, where there's the good deeds and the bad deeds, and we have a little hairy devil over here taking the bad deeds. Give those to me, I like those, right? So he's coming up here, he's very cute actually. He comes and he takes the bad deeds over here, and this one's blowing a shofar. I can't see it so well, maybe you can see it's in his mouth. He's blowing the shofar over here. This angel over here is pointing to the goat, like, Abraham, over there, don't do this, go get the goat over there. And this angel is bringing Yitzchak wearing the same outfit, bringing Yitzchak out of some kind of other realm. Some people say it's a cave because there's darkness over there, and there would have been ostensibly more darkness in here, but it chipped away. These are made of like gold leaf and things like that, right? So it chips away. And scholars have interpreted this in a way that aligns with my reading of the medieval midrashim as bringing Yitzchak from Gan Eden. That this is a resurrection motif. That here's the Akedah, and here's, maybe, it's not necessarily saying that he actually died per se, it could be, but some kind of death motif is in here because he's being resurrected, he's being brought from Gan Eden, brought back. Maybe his soul is being brought back or whatever it is, but there's that kind of motif there. So these are the medieval images. Isaac is a child. Isaac is temple sacrifice. Isaac is fulfilling a child's duty to be a sacrifice on behalf of their parents. And Isaac is resurrected from the place of the dead. Brought back from the dead. If you could see here, these last 2 words, Mechayeh HaMeitim, it appears on the same page where the bracha of Mechayeh HaMeitim is also. The bracha about resurrecting the dead. So it's really beautiful. I mean, not beautiful in that it feels all warm and toasty inside, but how it all really fits together. Yeah.
I learned at one point that Hashem gave us karbanos
Yes.
because the rest of the world was involved in child sacrifice, and so a lot of times the mitzvahs he gave us were like tweaked to show I see your need,
Yes.
but we do things, I want you to do things differently.
Right, it had to be within like a familiar thing, and then increasingly God could make us
Right.
normal or ethical, so to
And
speak.
not only, yeah, and according to different moral principles.
Yes,
And the fact that Abraham was told to stay his hand and not actually sacrifice confirms that.
yes.
So why did, in the Middle Ages, they feel the need to go back to the real sacrifice concept?
I'll tell you something about Rav Chaim Salvation Grach, who's a preeminent scholar in medieval Jewish history, once wrote, I wish I had the quote. I wish I had the quote. I should memorize this quote. He says something about, we go around the hallways of like a pediatric cancer ward, and we see children being tortured, right? But of course, we understand that they're being tortured for a bigger and better result, right? It's not that they're being tortured qua torture, they're being tortured to achieve something better, right? For medieval Ashkenazi Jews, for whom Olam Haba and God and Judaism was so like a real entity, they perceived themselves, the rabbis perceived the community as a completely and utterly pious community, that whatever the community was doing was representation of what was correct. That's to the extent that they viewed, that their self-image was of being the holiest, pious community, most pious community that ever existed. And they really felt God and Olam Haba very tangibly. For them, the difference between staying alive and becoming Christian and dying was enormous, right? In other words, they would never entertain the notion of becoming Christian when they had the opportunity to go into Olam Haba and live in bliss. So when faced with those two things,
This particular way, which had seemed to
so
be condemned.
so they have these two options: be baptized or die. Once they're dying, they're saying it's a meaningful death. It's a temple sacrifice. It atones for our sins. It's something that is part of our tradition. It's something that God wants.
But there's a difference between dying, being a martyr yourself,
Yes.
and sacrificing your child.
Right. So one of the things that we see is this kind of notion of like intentionality. It's not that I'm just dying. I'm not a passive martyr. It's not that the Christians have determined what my destiny is. I am determining that this death is going to be meaningful. It's in my hands. And the way I'm going to make it meaningful is by making this into a sacrificial act. Not just a random act. Not just something that somebody is putting upon me, but I'm taking matters into my own hands. And I am declaring that a sacrifice. Because that's the only death that's meaningful. Is this, like, how else could they make that
To
meaningful?
sacrifice their child, not only to sacrifice
So
themselves. That's where I have the problem.
That's where any normal person would have a problem. That's why I studied it, because this was an anomalous time in Jewish history that I couldn't believe. That's why it doesn't happen again. You know, they also sacrificed themselves. It wasn't just their children, although I will admit that some of my readings of the medieval text indicate that their kind of first gut reaction was their kids. Because the best sacrifice, because in their minds, in good times, when they're circumcising their kids and bringing them for parties on Shavuos, right, their 5-year-old parties, even under the best of circumstances, they see children as sacrificial in some way. And so their first kind of inclination when they're faced with baptism or death is, our kids have to be sacrificed rather than be baptized. Sometimes to the point, like the question that was posed to the Maharam, where they don't sacrifice themselves afterwards. Why didn't that guy who wrote to the Maharam, that Shaila, why did he write, I sacrificed my child and now I feel guilty? Can I kill myself? Well, why did you kill yourself then? Like, why did you just sacrifice? There are these kind of notions that like the ultimate sacrifice is child sacrifice, which is very troubling, granted, yes.
Because I see that maybe as because the child's going to the good place. That's the good thing.
Right, you want to do a
They
good
are
thing by your
left
child.
with that tremendous pain
Right.
now, and so that's really the sacrifice. The child's having the benefit in their mind of going to Olam Haba and
Right.
going to be with, whereas they now are left here to suffer. That's the sacrifice,
Right.
not that.
It absolutely could be. You know, you see different things at different times, because you do see, they imagine like an alternate universe, an Olam Haba, wherein their community is recreated in the heavens, where all of the holy martyrs are sitting together, the adults are sitting together, the Hasidim, and you know, sitting right next to God, and being amazing, whatever it is, right? So they do have this notion that they would also go to paradise and, and sit next to God and good things would come to them and that's much better than being. So why all these stories where they're not doing that? Why they're just focusing on their children? But yeah, I think that in general you're right.
Isn't the bottom line, what does God want of us? And we know because we have the Torah. So that's why it's so troublesome.
So one of the things, and these are amazing questions, one of the things that we see when they're asking the question during the Crusades, what does God want of us? They say, this is all orchestrated by God. God wanted the Crusades in some way. It must be that we're sinners. And the way that you atone for a sin, if you're dying anyway, and you want to atone for this sin in your death, is to make it a sacrificial death. That's how you get kapara. That's how you atone for sins. So all of these kind of notions of themselves as sinners and the other world is a blessed place where everything will be forgiven, whatever, makes them
want to sacrifice their child.
That's the problematic point.
Okay.
Absolutely, 100%.
Sorry
Look for
to
the book.
belabor it, but we're
Look
stuck
for the
with
book.
that.
One of the reasons why I was a little bit hesitant to write about this was because of how troubling it is, how like anti-Semites could capitalize on it. You know what I'm saying? So I have to be very careful, and I have to make sure my investigation is very complete, and see and really be able to explain, I don't know, where this came from, or just say it's an exception. I don't know how to explain it.
Were you
Yes.
discouraged?
No, I wasn't discouraged. But there was an article about my work in the Standard that started out with this, and I didn't say it in the interview. This is not something that I said in the interview, but the writer started out with, this is something. Oh, Julianowski Goldstein is doing this research that could really be fodder for anti-Semites, kind of thing. I was like, yes, it could, and I always knew it could. There was a scholar who wrote a book called Bloody Passover in Italy, which was not good scholarship, where he was writing about Jewish child sacrifice, and he was basically like written out of the academic community because it really smelled of real anti-Semitic ritual murder, kind of things that Jews really did ritual murder, and rightfully so, because his scholarship was very shoddy and he was being very selective. He wasn't making. He was trying to make that argument, and he wasn't really being very accurate. So that made sense. But what that means for me in writing in a similar vein is that I have to be extremely careful, and my scholarship has to be sound, right on target.
Don't talk to the Jewish.
Yeah.
Is this in any way, or how does this relate to what happened in Masada, where, it doesn't seem like that was something where it was spiritual, it was...
Good. So the people in the Middle Ages, the Jews of the Middle Ages don't invoke Masada. Okay, when they invoke the Akedah, they invoke other sacrifices, they invoke the sacrifice of the 10 martyrs, they invoke the sacrifice of the woman and her 7 sons, that kind of thing. They don't invoke Masada. And an interesting thing about Masada is that Masada doesn't appear in the Gemara. It doesn't appear in the Talmud either, and it happened in Talmudic times when the Talmud was being written. And so the general consensus, the sense that we get is that the rabbis didn't agree with Masada, right? The message of Masada, the zealots of Masada were essentially saying, if there is no Beit HaMikdash, we'd rather be dead. Judaism dies with the Beit HaMikdash, right? We will sacrifice ourselves. And the rabbis did not want that message. The message the rabbis wanted was, the Beit HaMikdash is no longer here, which is extremely detrimental, harmful, and terrible and painful, but Judaism can live on in another way, and that other way is called Yavna and Torah Sheba'al Peh, right? We'll create a portable Beit HaMikdash, so to speak. Judaism will follow us into the exile, right? So they didn't want to advocate this glorification that Josephus does when he writes about Masada, of the Masada people. It's not the message that they wanted. So the rabbis after them and the traditional Jews after them also don't invoke Masada because that's not the same message, So it's not exactly the same thing, although it has similarities. Anyway, okay, I'm going to just see what time it is. Great. I'm going to skip around a little bit. I was going to do Caravaggio and Rembrandt, but I think I'm not going to do either one of those. What we see, and just to give you a little snapshot. What we see, different from what we saw before at the Chartres, right? This is the Chartres again. What we see in the early Renaissance in Caravaggio is we don't see them harmonious anymore, okay? This is protest now. This is piety in the beginning, now it's protest and Christian art as well. just like this one is made of one single piece of marble, right? It would indicate that somehow they're harmonious, and that's consciously done. When artists do things like that, they're making a statement. Ostensibly, this is one piece, they should be one, but they're not one. There's pain here, there's twisted, bodies. So there's a very different feel. There's a very different feel here. This is actually Caravaggio. We see here again. You're like drawn right here, you see this. There's an avoidance of eye contact. There's no harmony here. They're not looking at each other. He's like kind of even looking past. The angel is looking this way. I don't know, like kind of at him. He's looking past the angel. He's crying out in pain. He's looking up maybe at Abraham, like, what are you doing? This is a tense representation of
And the ram is looking at Abraham saying, take me.
Oh, take me out here. Right, good, right. That's a good point. The angel is saying, there's a ram.
Yeah.
There's a ram. And he's saying, what? I can hear you. Right? He's like, he's not really, he's oblivious to the fact that there's a lamb there, right?
And the
So
knife
this is like,
right in the center.
what?
The knife is right.
Night is right in the center. This is sacrificial. Like, this is going to happen, and the angel kind of can't stop it, right? So there's this tension. Okay, I'll say right away. I thought it would be interesting for us to look at Chagall as well. Chagall, who is perhaps the most prolific artist when it comes to the Akedah. He made a lot of images of the Akedah, born into a Hasidic community in Russia in the 1880s. And Chagall, what he does in this particular image of the Akedah, I only picked one, is he surrounds the image with additional things that function as sort of like a midrash, right? His modern midrash on the biblical narrative. So first, alluding to Abraham's, piety, whatever, and listening, his obedience to God, he has Abraham kind of like, and this is, I don't know if you see everything with this chair here. He has Abraham's hand resting on Isaac's thigh, and Isaac's general region and everything has the color of blood, right? Indicating, first of all, pointing to the fact that Abraham sacrificed Isaac, which the text tells us about. He also, he listened to God in that sense, that he circumcised Isaac. But there also seems to indicate that maybe there was some kind of actual cutting that took place. It's very red over there, and there's blood on the knife. Okay, there's blood on the knife, so he either circumcised him here. Circumcision is aligned with the Akedah because this is an Akedah scene, but there's a circumcision motif, there's a bloody motif, blood, right? Abraham, when God tells Abraham to do stuff, he does it and it involves blood, right? At first glance, when you're looking at the scene, it appears as if the Isaac is maybe not necessarily killed, right? It's not so clear. I mean, Isaac is kind of lying there, maybe dead, but it's not so clear that he's killed because there is the angel coming on the scene and saying, stop, right? The angel is included, right? So it's not necessarily, that's what you get at first glance, but again, upon closer look, you see that there's blood on the knife. Abraham is looking at the angel with kind of like bewilderment, confusion. He's like, huh? What? Right? And there are other things that kind of indicate that maybe the angel is coming a little bit too late. Like, he's oblivious to the lamb over there, right? He's looking at the angel. He's not looking at the lamb, like the text tells us he looked at the lamb. The angel who comes with like outstretched arms, which we know like is always known, from Pesach even, the outstretched arms are like symbols of redemption, like I will come and save you, the outstretched arms, but they're a little bit short, like they can't really save anything. Abraham's like really big, Isaac is really big, and he's like reaching out, but he's not, he seems to be like very weak, that angel. He's not really able to protect anybody or really stop what's going on here, deliver them from this horrible circumstance. We have also, deviating from the text itself, we have the second angel over here. There's not only one angel, but in the upper left-hand corner we have a second angel, and the second angel points that away, right? Pointing to crucifixion scene, there's a cross over here, right? So we have this notion that the angel is coming to give us the conclusion. This story is about this, right? He's saying, the second angel is coming and saying, the divine promise, your destiny, right, what's the end result of all this is this. In other words, this is what you are producing, which is continued suffering of the Jewish people, right? A la what Chagall knew about and experienced himself. So the second angel reaffirms that there's going to be, that the divine promise that there's going to be a lot of descendants, but the descendants are going to have to wrestle with Christianity. They're going to have to encounter Christianity, and Christianity will ultimately in some way triumph. So this is kind of like a testimony to the continuous suffering of the Jewish people in the end, right? The Akedah might have actually happened. He's trying to stop it, but it's not really working. He's not looking at the lamb, he doesn't even know it's there. And this angel is saying, look into the distance, Abraham. Look what has been wrought. Lots of Jews, sure, but they have the cross amongst them. The ram is also, if you could see over here, the ram is like behind like a tree. Like he's not really
He's
so.
really small.
Yeah, he's really small. He doesn't take center stage at all. He's behind like this one large, overwhelming tree. So the ram's role as like the substitute is like, it doesn't look like an even exchange at all. There's this huge Isaac and this tiny little ram. The ram is not really, so present and so visible. So his role is much less certain. So the conclusion from this is that, it's depicting Abraham as having some kind of it's inserting a death motif. There is some kind of sacrificial thing that took place, and it's going and it results in the suffering of the Jews. Circumstances.
Is that Sarah?
Yep.
Yeah, she's there too.
And
Yeah, so there's an
much bigger than
insertion.
the ram.
There's an insertion of Sarah in other places as well. That's Rembrandt. This is a horrible image. If you've ever heard of a Pieta, this image of the Virgin Mary holding her dead child, Jesus, we have that in the Hebrew Crusade Chronicles as well. We have a woman, Rachel, who slaughters her children, and the Crusaders, and it says she hides them in her sleeves. I guess it means very long sleeves, very big, wide sleeves. She hides them in her sleeves. It says they're convulsing and writhing, and she's hiding them under her clothing, and the Christians come in, and they say, show us what you have, and show us the money that you have in your sleeves, because they see she's, the Jews and their money, right? They see the sleeves are so full of something, they say, show us your money. She opens it up, and it's her dead children in her arms, like other. So it's very horrible, this horrible image. We have here, a Pieta kind of thing also. This is the faceless, huge, overtime, almost grotesque kind of Sarah. Agonizing, crying, weeping, screaming, like the call of the shofar over her children. It could be that's kind of a shofar kind of shadow or whatever. I don't know, some people say yes, happening there. So this is very, very, very evocative. Here is a ladder, which the artist himself, he's Mordechai Ardon, 1947, the artist himself has spoken about as being the ladder of Jacob that's falling, right? So that kind of dream is falling away, and also the tracks leading to Auschwitz. It's a double entendre of the ladder. So that's a kind of horrific kind of image. What else did I show you quickly? This is also Sarah hiding underneath the altar when he's going to be sacrificed. Something to talk about. That's during the Vietnam War. Okay, we'll do one more. This is Menashe Kashmin, the sacrifice of Isaac. I tried to find a picture of my kids in front of this because when I was at Tel Aviv University, this was on the campus. It still is to that day. And I was like, my kids know I think about the Akedah and child martyrdom a lot, which scares the heck out of them. They're like, oh, that's that image. Go take a picture, right? But I couldn't find the one I needed. Anyway, so the Akedah kind of appears as a central obsession of Israeli artists and writers and poets and thinkers and whatever. So in Israel, we have a kind of Caravaggio-like depiction of terror and pain. In this specific image, Kadishman really problematizes the roles. Thinking about the sacrifices that the soldiers are making, that the Jewish people are making in order to acquire and retain the land of Israel and gain acceptance for what they're trying to do, Kadishman says, blurs the lines, right? Abraham is not there at all. Abraham is not present. There's like a seamless continuum. These are all one and the same kind of thing. The ram is on top, and it's a scary ram. So it's imposing. He's on top, and he's looking down. The scariness. Look, it's an evil ram, right? It's a scary ram, and it triumphs over Isaac. And Isaac is this innocent thing who's like kind of subject to the ram. And according to one scholar, Kathy Caruth, she said Kadishman saw the Akedah as, quote, a symbol signifying the need for an immediate cessation of the sacrificing of young people in the wars of all nations, now without delay. So we'll see next time when we discuss Israeli literature, we see how the Akedah plays out in the poetry and maybe other things that Israeli culture put forth. We'll see this kind of real protest. We'll see an affinity and a treasuring of the Akedah in one way and a real protest against the Akedah in another way, as the Akedah is a representation of modern Akedah that they don't want anymore. Stop this. Very different than what they were saying in the Middle Ages. So hopefully we'll do that together next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.